Well, good evening. I know the group is slowly kind of building here, but I'll go ahead and start us off. I'm Dr. James Broomall, an Associate Professor of History at Shepherd University and the Director of the George Heather Moore Center for the Study of the Civil War. Below me, next to me on your screen rather, and you might want to wave, is Dr. Ben Bankhurst, an Assistant Professor of History at Shepherd University. Claire Tryon is a recently graduated undergraduate from Shepherd. Michael Mastrianni, bearded, we all have beards, sorry, the men that is likewise a recent grad of Shepherd University. And next to me, at least on my screen, is Travis Shaw, a longtime friend of the center and of me personally, and Travis at Mosby Heritage Area. You probably know Travis from a lot of his online programming that he does through Mosby, Historians on Tap, and other arenas. Welcome to those of you tuning in. Our numbers are growing here. We got our good friend Mike from Maine. We have some friends from England, some friends from West Virginia, Rick Wolf. Hello all. So although we are the Center for the Study of the Civil War, we branch out into all sorts of historical periods. And I wanted to do a couple of things tonight. And first I wanted to feature some of our undergraduates and their really interesting, well, former undergraduates, alumni of Shepherd, and the really interesting research that they conducted in conjunction with my dear friend Ben Bankhurst. And these students did some just absolutely phenomenal work under Ben's guidance. And then when it comes to loyalism, I could think of no better man than Travis Shaw to talk about that. And so we're going to keep this in a relatively Chesapeake context. So we're not going to talk about loyalism throughout the Americas. We're going to keep it rather regionally focused. And then we're also going to introduce this evening some different types of source materials, do some screen shares. And so with that, I'm going to start here with a very broad based question. And I know a couple of you tuning in are probably experts in this area. I know some of you tuning in are just curious. It's a Tuesday evening, you're not going anywhere. And so here you are. And so I think for those of you who probably have a broad knowledge like myself, there's a very familiar quote that you've probably heard, and that is from John Adams. John Adams is an authoritative voice from the Revolutionary era. And Adams offers a quote that is often cited by very good historians, but as we're going to talk about here in a minute, it's a kind of a complicated notion that he's going to deliver to us. And so in 1815, so this is in the wake of the War of 1812, well after the American Revolution, Adams essentially divides the American population up into thirds. And I'm looking at the letter here, he basically says 1/3 are averse to the revolution, right? So these are figures who don't like it. 1/3 are patriots, and 1/3 essentially want nothing to do with the affair. So from that math, we can then understand that about 1/3 of the American population, according to John Adams, were loyalists. So to start this off, Travis and Ben, is this true? Or is this time to bust some myths here? So tell us the reality of the situation in the Americas during this period. Who were loyalists? Who were loyal?
Wow. I wish I could give you a straight up easy answer for this. It all very much depends on how we define a loyalist. There's been a lot of historical thinking, a lot of writing about this. We kind of tend to split loyalists into active loyalists, those who actively take a role in putting down the revolution, or whether that's militarily or through other actions, and then passive loyalists, people who just refuse to participate. And it's hard to say. I mean, my reading of the situation is that Adams probably overestimates the number of loyalists. A lot of the more recent scholarship puts the population to maybe 20–25% are really what we could define as loyalists in some way, shape, or form. But of course, that is going to change drastically over the course of the war. As armies move from one area to another, as the political situation changes, people who might be pro-independence one day might turn around and become loyalists, or it might shift as the course of the war changes, shift from patriot to loyalist or vice versa. I don't know. What do you think, Ben?
Yeah, well, I agree with many of the points. I think it does seem that the consensus now is about 20 to 25% are what we might call hot Tories or active loyalists. But again, I think there's reason to think that, you know, our impressions of what loyalism was are in a way sort of the product of the loyalists themselves, right? So many, what we think of as a loyalist tends to be a loyalist refugee, those who fled the revolution and were able to establish themselves in the British Isles or across the British Empire in Canada, for instance. They're the torchbearers of loyalism after the war. And of course, when we think about loyalist centers, they tend to be eastern seaports, for instance. I'm thinking Norfolk, Virginia, or New York City, obviously. And what that our eastward emphasis, sort of emphasis on loyalism obfuscates what Western loyalism may have looked like. And of course, we don't know necessarily how many Western loyalists there are. We know there are sizable loyalist conspiracies that remain quite kind of shrouded in mystery, like the New River Loyalist conspiracies, or even the
Naples Rebellion.
Yeah. So it might have been a far more widespread phenomena than the numbers seem to suggest when one considers loyalism in the Eastern context.
And I think what you've hinted at, there was a certain fluidity to identity during this period, which I think is absolutely critical. In hindsight, we like to think of the vast majority of the American population as being sort of true patriots. They never wavered on the cause, whereas most of them came to this cause quite late. I mean, they were quite loyal to the British government well through the early 1770s, at least the vast majority of Americans. And then once there, on the more micro level, as you said, identities shift over time depending upon where there's military success, where there's military defeat, how the ebbs and flow of the revolution politically. And so I think that's a really important point that you all are making. So loyalists could be anyone, I guess is the takeaway here. But Adams' numbers are probably overblown. Although even that fact sort of changes over time. Is that correct?
Yeah, I think he oversells the number of loyalists, and I think he undersells the number of people who were fence sitters, who really could go either way, who didn't really want to take an active role. I think, more and more that's what the scholarship seems to indicate.
Yeah. I think from Adams' perspective, he wants to, in typical fashion, he's quite overdramatic on this, right? He wants to show that there's a significant portion of the American population that's committed to the cause of revolution, right? But they're pit against this formidable enemy within the context of an equal number of militant loyalists, right? When in reality, it's probably true that the largest single demographic in the United States at the time of the founding were those who wanted to just get by, right? Which isn't as glorious a narrative as Adams would want us to believe, right?
Sure. So I think what's interesting about this topic and why I sort of assembled you all is how we get this question. So if we have someone as authoritative as John Adams sort of missing the mark, then that might suggest that our understanding of loyalists and loyalism is maybe hard to get at. And so that in turn starts the big questions about what types of evidence do we use to understand this phenomenon of the mid to late 18th century. And so I think maybe what might be useful is to turn to you, Ben, and have you talk a little bit about more broadly the LCC, and then we could sort of drill down into some of the work that our students have done. And as I said, maybe do some screen shares with the audience tonight, show them some of the evidence that we're working with.
Great. Well, thank you, Jim. And I think if I could start with a shameless plug, I'll go ahead and do that. Which is that much of the work that our students have done on the subject is part of a larger project, a digital humanities project that a colleague of mine, Dr. Kyle Roberts, who's now at the American Philosophical Society, and I devised a few years ago while team teaching a asynchronous online course on the topic of the American Revolution. So we created a database funded through the generous donations of the Lapidus Foundation at the Omohundro Institute for Early American Studies, called the Maryland Loyalism Project. Now, the Maryland Loyalism Project seeks to make publicly available records related to the history of loyalism in Maryland, that are the records that are housed in the British National Archives, the records of the Loyalist Claims Commission. These are incredibly rich records, which contain obviously biographical information related to the Loyalist experience, but also financial information, and sort of network information. What did Loyalist networks look like? All of this information sort of comes out of the Loyalist Claims Commission papers. So at some point I'll talk about the aims of the project, but let me just give you some background on the Loyalist Claims Commission, or the LCC for short, in general.
That's what people in the know call it, Ben, right? The LCC.
Yeah, that's what us cool kids call it, the LCC.
Yeah, I've heard that.
But the LCC is established by an act of Parliament in 1781 in order to properly assess the claims made by Loyalist refugees arising from the losses that they accrued as a byproduct of their loyalty to the British Crown. So your listeners may not be aware, but the fact of the matter is that more people fled the American Revolution as refugees than fled the French Revolution in the decades following. It's a massive number. And I think when we think about the creation of, we as Americans tend to think of the American Revolution as this moment of genesis for the new nation, right? It's a period, it's a sort of post-colonial moment in which we see the birth of a new nation. But what we could also, I think, take into consideration is that the modern nation of Canada really is, or at least Anglophone Canada, is born out of this experience as well, because so many fled, so many Loyalist refugees fled to what would soon become Upper Canada in the aftermath of the war. So the LCC sought to try to figure out what losses were accrued by these people and how to best pay for them. All things considered, the claims themselves read a lot like legal records, in which each refugee attempts to secure as much financial assistance from the Commission, who met both in Halifax, Nova Scotia, and in London, by proving that they suffered for the loyalty to the Crown. So if I could, I'll just share a page from the LCC, unless I completely hijack this and then. Okay. Can you see this now?
No.
Okay. This doesn't work. It's not the end of the world.
Had it earlier.
I had it earlier. I might pull it up later. But needless to say, I think what we should think about when we think about the Loyalist Claims Commission papers is I want you to imagine this. You are a claimant. You sit in front of a commission made up of 3 commissioners, perhaps some of their secretaries as well, in which you present materials proving or attesting to your loyalty to the British Crown. So each of the records created by the LCC starts out with a memorial in which the loyalist gives basically a potted biography of themselves and tries to prove that they were indeed loyal throughout the revolution and deserve British government support for the losses that they accrued during the revolution. And secondly, you then have a schedule of losses where they list all of the losses that they've accrued, as much as they possibly can. There is a lot of evidence to suggest that I think Travis might be able to attest to this himself, that most of these claims are grossly exaggerated as a way of, they recognize that the British government's not going to give them everything they want. So they try to, try to
pad the numbers a little bit.
Yeah, right, exactly.
I think too, like the broader point made to discuss is, I mean, how does one prove one's loyalty, right? So if we're talking about this period of great fluidity of identity, people kind of slipping in and out of the category of loyalist.
Mhm.
And how does one sort of go about in a legal way proving that he or she was loyal throughout the course of the American Revolution when it seems to be incredibly difficult to do?
No, it's a wonderful question, and even even when these people act disloyally, they try to craft their narrative to say they that they were always loyal in their hearts. For instance, my favorite example of this, and we were talking about this earlier. Well, one way you would prove it is to prove military, commitment, right? That would be the best way to go about doing it. And Travis, I'm sure we'll talk more about this in a second. There's a quite a famous loyalist named Alexander Chesney, who signs up for service with among the British. He fights at I believe he's at King's Mountain with the Loyalist militia, etc. But at points he also serves with the Patriots, and he has to square the circle in front of the commission. So he says, "Well, look, I served with the Patriots temporarily. A, they made me, and secondly, don't worry, we were fighting the Cherokee." As if that makes it okay, right? So we weren't fighting British soldiers, right, necessarily.
Yeah.
So we should take these claims, worth a pinch of salt to a degree when we know what the motivations of the claimants are. That said, there's still lots of fascinating material there, but I'm speaking too much. So somebody please say something about the motivations of loyalism or of these people and whether or not they can be trusted.
Well, this might be a good segue to Claire, if I'm not mistaken. So Claire has actually worked with a lot of the Maryland material, and Claire, let me turn it over to you. I mean, I think what's so interesting is some of the gendered readings that we can give to this evidence, some of the overall claims that you found, and some of the women that are featured. And so, if you could highlight for us, some of your experiences within the archive, so to speak, and what are some of the findings they were able to sort of draw out from this, again, specifically talking about the experiences of loyalists in Maryland.
Sure. So I just kind of want to go back really quickly to Dr. Bankhurst's point on, they're trying to, especially for women, you're trying to present yourself as an active loyalist or a loyalist in general. And so you're talking to these, to this commission was made entirely of men. And then they're transcribing your biography. And I think that gives men a lot of power to kind of like filter all these female narratives, especially with, there's this one woman, and Elizabeth Delaney, who's one of the 5 female loyalists that we have. And there are times when she seems to be an exaggerated character, and I don't know how much of that is her and how much of that is their interpretation of her. But I think you have that element to it as well. But from what I've found in terms of representing their loyalty, a lot of loyalists, they add in there, loyalist has a wife and family. And this seems to be like a strategy of increased sympathy for themselves. Okay. Because the loss isn't just, the loss isn't just affecting them, but it's affecting, these maybe more vulnerable parties. But I think I was counting today, and there in the Maryland Loyalist claims are like 70 people, 70 claimants are around there, and only 5 of them are women. Okay. 4 of these women are claiming property or loss on behalf of deceased husbands. Only one of them, Elizabeth Allen, is establishing her claim of loyalty through acts of service to the crown. Specifically, she talks about how she aided all these imprisoned British soldiers by giving them, goods that they needed or certain freedoms, or in some cases, freeing them from prison in general.
Thank you. Yeah, and I mean, from your experience, give us some sense of the texture of these. Are these rich documents? Are the narratives, multi-page, quite broad? Even though they're constructs in this sort of immediate reality, how much you're able to sort of get out of these sources. And Ben here is sharing with us what one of these memorials would have looked like.
I kind of found them surprisingly fun to read, especially when you have, so there's one, Henry Hartford, and his whole story goes over like 2 different volumes and is like hundreds of pages.
Okay.
So, and it's kind of soap opera drama-esque. But I think for me, there was a lot to find there, and especially in terms of gender, from what we do have, the female loyalists tend to be shorter, but counting the pages, I think it really depends more on perhaps socioeconomic status, but I'd have to look more into that. That's just my feeling from the research I did last summer.
Okay, wonderful. Thank you so much, Claire. Ben, do you want to add anything?
Yeah, that's wonderful, Claire. I think one thing to remember is when the commission itself establishes criteria as to what counts as loyalty, and the top of the list is obviously military, commitment. So it's striking to see how these women who effectively cannot meet those standards of that sort of highest echelon of the armed loyalists, how they still manage to sort of craft a narrative that restores their agency, and it shows a real awareness of what the commission is looking for. Right? They know how to sell themselves. Often, even when they're playing victim, when they're saying, "I was left absolutely destitute by this. I have no other, no other form of financial sort of recourse. I absolutely need this." They're demonstrating they're reading the room quite well, and they tend to be quite successful. And it strikes me that there's a Rebecca Brannon, who's at James Madison University. She did a lot of work on the South Carolina Loyalists, and she looked at those South Carolina Loyalists who remained in South Carolina once the United States is established. And a lot of widows of Loyalist militia activists would go before the state, go before the legislature, and basically said, "My husband was an absolute idiot," or "My husband was completely deluded, and I shouldn't be punished for this." Right? I mean, there is a sense that women in these scenarios know how to sort of extract what they want from these institutional frameworks. And I think that's certainly on display in the work that Claire has done with these Maryland Loyalists, which is very exciting.
I think, just looking at these claims too, for folks who might not be as familiar with the reality of loyalism during the war, they really do show not only the breadth of people that are applying for these claims, people who would consider themselves loyalists. I think, in the popular imagination, we tend to think of very socially conservative, very wealthy people invested in the system, when in reality, we're seeing people from every walk of life, every socioeconomic group, and we're seeing an incredible variety of motivation. Not everybody is a dyed-in-the-wool, die-hard monarchist who believes in the system. Some people are pushed into it. Just as an anecdote, I had an ancestor who was a loyalist who filed a claim. It was literally because his neighbors came to his house, demanded he, declare himself in favor of the Committee of Safety, and he refused. He didn't think it was something he should do. So they literally drove him and his family out of his house. You're going to see that a lot in the South. It's not necessarily ideology, it's neighbors settling old scores with neighbors, things that aren't necessarily ideologically driven. And I think that kind of gets lost in the story, but it comes out in a lot of these narratives, in a lot of these descriptions of these sufferings. Some of these people just wanted to stay out of the way and were forced to choose.
Yeah, no, I think that's a really good point, is that we tend to always think in these terms of it is an ideological struggle. And in fact, in many instances, as Travis said, these are long-standing grudges or animosities that have been kind of simmering for a while. That's why it is in many instances a civil war, right, in a different era. But the conflict gets really, really messy on the ground. So I think that's a
Yeah, we'll get into that later. But places like New Jersey, places like the Carolinas, it is absolutely a civil war.
Before I move it over, we did have one question that relates to, and this is a very logical question that relates to what we've shown so far. I mean, of these Maryland claimants, are the vast majority successful? Are any of them successful? Do they award the full amount, a partial amount? I mean, give us some sense of how these petitioners are actually doing with their claims.
Well, can you hear me?
Yeah.
Great. In terms of the Maryland claimants, they're about as successful as as most other claimants. I think, what is it? It's somewhere between 10 and 15% are thrown out for lack of evidence.
Yeah.
Just to give you an indication as to how much money was claimed overall, about slightly over £8 million sterling was claimed by Loyalist claimants in over all of the colonies. About 3,300,000 were actually awarded. So you go forward with your claim, you could expect that you're going to get maybe a third of what you claim, right? And even then, a lot of the awards are sort of government offices or sort of salaries, not necessarily full restitution for property lost. But the Marylanders, I think they're as successful as most other Loyalists dealing with the claims. The Marylanders also suffer from the fact that Maryland isn't a theater of operation for the most part. So in that sense, they can't say, my barn was burned down by these, treasonous patriots. It's harder to demonstrate that sort of sufferance narrative. That said, there are quite a few there's some harrowing stories that come out of Maryland regarding the treatment of Loyalists. And Claire, you're gonna have to remind me here, you're the one who worked with the census so much, if you can remember which memorial this is coming from, or Michael for that matter. I think it's the George Chalmers Memorial, where he's going up to George Chalmers is an office holder prior to the Revolution. He's involved with the Maryland government prior to the Revolution, and he ascends some stairs in Annapolis to attend a meeting as to what to do with as to how to deal with with common sense and the independence movement. And as he's going up the stairs, a friend of his comes down bloodied, having been beaten, for expressing sympathies to the crown. There's also another infamous case, which doesn't necessarily come up in the Claims Commission, but the alleged Fredrik treason trials, which we talked about over the summer, in which Loyalists were sentenced to be drawn, hanged, and quartered for a conspiracy to free prisoners of war in Winchester and Fort.
Yeah, and tried without a jury. It's tried by a commission. So yeah. It certainly adds an interesting layer to that story.
Absolutely. But so I mean, it's the treatment of Loyalists. It really depends on where you are. But I mean, it's you can understand why so many might have kept their loyalties to themselves. Or on the other side of it, if you're a patriot in a Loyalist neighborhood, you're not going to be in New York City, for instance. You're not going to be very, outward in your commitments. But
yeah, and that kind of came up earlier in the comment bar, so I'm glad you all referenced that fact. People are already clamoring for interest in these LCC. That's the way LCC.
Loyalist Claims Commission papers.
Yes. So again, can you remind us if just a broad audience member wants to access said documents, how can they do so?
Well, if they're a paid subscriber to Ancestry.com, I believe they're on Fold 3, which is one of the. I don't want to give too much to Ancestry, but watch the space if you're interested in the LCC records. At the end of the summer, we will be publishing all of the volumes related with high quality images and transcriptions and biographical data related to the state of Maryland at the Loyalist claim. It'll be under the title of the Loyalist Maryland Loyalist Project. We haven't settled on a URL yet, so just you'll be able to Google that by August, and they'll be readily available. alongside other material related to the history of loyalism in the state. We hope, and the dream is, as we gear up for the 250th anniversary of the Declaration of Independence, that we're able to expand this project out to include other states, colonies. Will be heavily leaning on Travis Shaw, I'm sure, when it comes to the history of Virginia loyalism, a subject that I find so terrifyingly daunting, I avoid it at all costs.
Well, we're gonna have to reach out to Stephanie Seal as well, because
Absolutely.
she's really the one spearheading all that. So.
Fabulous, and you're going to talk a little bit about that in a minute here, but before doing so, there's one other big evidence base that I think is just absolutely fascinating that Michael worked with, and this is something with which I am vaguely familiar. I had friends in graduate school that worked with the so-called Book of Negroes, and that's the title, not, I'm not using those terms, but that's the title of the book. And so Michael and Ben and Travis, throw it in as you want, but what exactly is this source, again, the quote unquote Book of Negroes, and what were you able to sort of derive from this interesting source of evidence? And then if you want, Michael, why don't you do your screen share and show us what exactly we're talking about here.
Sure. Can you guys see that?
Yep, perfect.
Sure. So this register, it was created in 1783 at the end by an order of Guy Carleton, who was the commandant for the British military. And it was a response to the expected Treaty of Paris, because the British were worried about having to pay back a monetary value for any formerly enslaved individual who made it to British lines and they were not giving back. And so this register, as you on your screen, this is the American version. There's two versions, British and American, and this version, as you see on your screen, on the far left, it lists the vessel in which they traveled on to Canada. Most Black loyalists made it to Canada. One went to, in the group I studied, one went to Germany and two went to the Bahamas. So this is a ship they traveled on. The next column on the second one is their destination, and then their name, their age, their description. If anybody was claiming them, in my groups, I did not see anybody claiming anyone, and then if they were currently owned by someone else. So this register provided a huge amount of information regarding each individual. And then typically, let me see if I can get it to work. I don't know if you guys can see the screen switch, but it may not be that great of quality. But on the secondary pages, this was additional information regarding each individual person. And typically in this section, we got where they came from, who formerly owned them with names, and as well as if they received a certificate of freedom, who gave it to them. And these certificates were granted by a commission at Fraunces Tavern in New York. And this commission, sort of kind of how the LCC operated, they heard each Black loyalist would come forward, because no matter whether or not they were getting a certificate, they had to give their story. And their story was given to the commission. And something the British decided to do was, if they believed them to be warranted, they would be given a certificate, and the certificate allowed them to travel anywhere they wanted to go. So, and this information right here is all used in this process to grant either certificate or to determine a monetary value. And I must emphasize that typically this information is not available. It's really rare to get age, even names. Names alone is it's massively important to say that we typically do not get names. And I was very lucky to be able to have this information, because it did help me use various other sources to try to get at some avenues about their lives.
And what was the overarching goal, Michael, and how you use this source, and what did you find?
Sure. So I use this as a way to get a broad view of the Black Loyalists. I compiled all of them into like a spreadsheet, and I conducted a statistical analysis to kind of get at what a Black Loyalist looked like in 1783. And I was able to look at like age distribution, gender, and stuff like that.
Travis is very happy.
Yeah, I want to see all of this.
He loves spreadsheets too. I'm the only cultural historian here. We don't do spreadsheets. I'm sorry. What types of new questions do you think can we pose with these sources? And maybe, Ben, do you want to sort of help us address that question? And Michael and Claire, feel free to add on as we're going through this.
Well, one thing I would like to, so Michael's research demonstrated that there are peaks in which, so from these interviews at the Francis Tavern, it's very clear that there are moments in which there are more formerly enslaved African-American loyalists sort of emerge into the British line. So Michael, could you talk about that for a second? When do you see in terms of the timeline of the war, where do we see high points of loyalist activity among the formerly enslaved of the Upper Chesapeake?
Sure. So in my research, I found that we see spikes primarily in 1777, and this is I looked at 54 individuals. Of these 54, 1777 had 14 people gaining their freedom and going to towards British lines at this time. And then I found that 1779 had the next highest activity, which was nearly less than half of the count in 1777. And so we see nearly 32 of the 54 get their freedom in a 2-year period, 1777 and 1779. And I was able to relate that to military movements in the region.
So what happens in 77?
We see the arrival of Vice Admiral Richard Howe's fleet in the Chesapeake. He lands at Elkton, or what was called the Head of Elk in Maryland, which is now known as Elkton. He lands there and meets his brother in preparation for the Philadelphia campaign. And in fact, one of the Black Loyalists, their note in their registered section says that they joined the fleet at this time. So we know for a fact that the fleet had impact on enslaved individuals in the region.
Right.
Yeah, I've seen runaway ads from this part of Northern Virginia that actually mention, may have gone off to join the fleet, or may have gone off to join the British ships in the bay. So in the summer and fall of 77. So
I'm going to go to a question here in a second, but I mean, one of the things that I remember from Michael's capstone and what you're talking about here is that we see a rather sophisticated network among the enslaved, that this information is being transmitted across plantations. We have a lot more tangible evidence about these types of information networks in the early to mid 19th century, but there's a very clear transmission of information in the 18th century. And, if I may, even going back into the early 18th century, we have some sense that before the Shenandoah Valley is occupied by white settlers, while it's still primarily an area occupied by Native Americans, many African Americans who were enslaved in the Tidewater and Piedmont were aware of that fact and started fleeing over into the Great Valley as a temporary refuge. And it does suggest a very sophisticated network of information transmission. And so that's something that we can't necessarily read from a source, but we can glean from a source. And so I know, again, we have some very sophisticated watchers here who know how to use evidence quite well, but more broadly, let's just say that sometimes sources are incredibly frustrating and we have to read across the grain and not necessarily make assumptions, but we can make some very educated guesses as to what might have been motivating them and how information might have been transmitted. our good dear friend Pierre Carmichael is tuning in. So this is entirely new territory for Dr. Carmichael, who is comfortably situated in the Civil War era most weeknights on Monday and Thursdays. And so Dr. Carmichael asks, and I think this is actually a really good question that's going to segment over to Travis here in a second. And thank you so much, Michael, for everything that you contributed and just some fascinating work. This is a slippery term, right? Black loyalist. And so Travis, I want you to respond to that. And then I want you to because that connects to Dunmore and that connects to the military participation of African Americans, and that in turn will allow you to sort of develop a conversation about white loyalists who served in the military in Virginia. So I'm going to give you all the hard questions, Travis.
Sure. No, I'm happy to work with that. Yeah, we talked a little bit earlier about motivations, about whether it's ideology or personal issues, and the thing that really defines the Black loyalist experience is this opportunity for freedom, and that is going to begin in November of 1776 with the proclamation by John Murray, Lord Dunmore, the last royal governor of Virginia, as a military expedient, as a way to kind of intimidate the patriots in Virginia. He is going to release this proclamation offering freedom to slaves and indentured servants in exchange for their military service. And it will lead to the creation of kind of the first Black loyalist military unit. He names them the Ethiopian Regiment. It's a very short-lived military unit made up of formerly enslaved people who join his small force in Southeast Virginia. But what's really remarkable here is, and you just mentioned these kind of networks of communication in the enslaved community. From Dunmore's proclamation, it kind of becomes the de facto British policy during the course of the war. It's almost, to put it in terms Dr. Carmichael will be comfortable with, it's very much kind of parallels what we see during the Civil War. Before emancipation is even a stated military aim, the reality on the ground, the reality wherever the army goes, is that enslaved people are going to go to the army looking for freedom. And it will become, under General Clinton, it will become kind of general British policy to liberate enslaved people who belong to patriot masters. And many of them will end up in the military. Of course, many of these people are also, women and children who are enslaved are coming to the British as well. So over the course of the war, we don't know the exact number, but thousands of individuals will find freedom within the safety of the British Army or in British occupied cities like New York.
And so the tension, Travis, is that the term loyalists is an identity that we're placing upon them, whereas the enslaved or the free now are doing so for a whole host of self-motivating factors.
Right. It's very much self-motivating. And it's, again, it's such a fascinating question, but there's so little documentation outside of the Book of Negroes. We know very little about the individuals that sought freedom with the British or found freedom with the British. It's also an incredibly complex issue because Dunmore's proclamation is supposed to only apply to people enslaved by patriots, by people in rebellion. And so you have someone like Lord Dunmore who's issuing this proclamation. He's got his own slaves, enslaved individuals that he owns with him when he's declaring this. So it's an incredibly complex, incredibly murky issue. But for many of these, for several thousand individuals, it's a risk worth taking, and many of them will find, as Michael was saying, after the war, they will find homes in Canada, in the West Indies, in the Bahamas. Some of them actually end up many decades later going to Sierra Leone, being part of the movement to resettle Sierra Leone with formerly enslaved people. So, again, it goes back to that question of how do we define a loyalist? These are not ideologically, diehard monarchists. These are people looking for an opportunity for personal freedom.
And Ben, is Epic Journeys of Freedom, is that the sort of the definitive book on this? Am I right?
There's Rough Crossings by Simon Schama as well.
Right. Yeah. Yeah.
And he begins one thing if I can add something to what Travis has just said. He begins, as he often does, with these little vignettes, and the vignette he begins with is this refugee who arrives in Nova Scotia who changes his name and records his name as British Liberty. I can't remember if that's the complete name or if there's a surname, but so for some, this does become ideological as well.
Yes, absolutely.
And I do, and we were speaking about memory earlier. It's fascinating to think that one of the founders of the NAACP in Frederick, Maryland, was a man named L.D. Nickens, who was born to a formerly enslaved family in Virginia. Now his name is actually Lord Dunsmore Nickens. So even in the Chesapeake, there's this sort of memory of that proclamation that survives into the 20th century. So it just to make that more complicated. Yes, these are at the very liberty for the patriots is abstract. Liberty for the enslaved is literal. So many of them many what we might call Black loyalists come to it out of a necessity, but that doesn't mean that they develop a sort of an intense ideology of loyalism after the fact or in the service of the British Army. If I could just add one further point to this, Claire, when she was doing a census of the material of those mentioned in the LCC records, came up to us and said, I'm uncomfortable with the fact that when I'm trying to identify people in these records, a major component are the unnamed enslaved people listed in the schedule of losses by loyalists. And one thing that we had to figure out, and we're still trying to figure out what to do here when it comes, so that we don't establish a hierarchy of white loyalists by virtue of the fact that we're using LCC material, is how do we give these people agency, or how do we deal with enslaved property among loyalists? And it strikes me when I went to we've been doing some work with the state archives in Maryland on this subject, and when loyalists flee, their land is confiscated by the patriot governments, and often that means the disbursement of that property, the carving up of property, and the resale of it to the highest bidder. This is a terrifying moment for the enslaved families on those plantations, right? This is a moment in which families are torn apart. So I think we should also be thinking about the revolutionary moment as a moment of opportunity for many who seek freedom through the British, but it's also a moment in which families are torn asunder. Families are dispersed because those living on these large loyalist estates, and many of those who make the LCC claims are the largest landowners in Maryland, namely Henry Harford, the last royal proprietor of the colony of Maryland. So we see this is a harrowing moment for many African Americans there, and I don't know how we're reckoning with that within the context of the database that we're creating. If any listeners have any ideas, please get in touch. We don't know. Claire, do you have anything you want to add to that, having dealt with these issues firsthand?
It's just so heartbreaking because for so many of them, I think there's only one claimant who even lists the names of his of the enslaved. And for so many others, you get a number. You don't even get ages or gender. So it's not even like you could use that. There's just nothing to go with.
Yeah, I remember one student in our class said, I was heartbroken to see that my loyalist, because they kind of adopted each loyalist, named his horses, but didn't name the enslaved laborers on his plantation, right? I mean, it's shocking.
It's another reason why that Book of Negroes is such a remarkable source.
Absolutely.
Nothing like it really exists for that period.
This isn't the neatest segue. I apologize. I normally moderate better, but let me bring it back around. And so Travis, when we had that early formula, we talked about, and I mean, thank you all. That was, I think, just some incredibly important insights and trying to grapple with like a really difficult source materials here. But to bring it back around to the beginning of the discussion, I mean, so we've been talking largely about those who have been political refugees, those who maybe were seeking freedom, those were ideological personal grudges, but there's also this really important military component to loyalism. So there is, boots on the ground, so to speak, where there's a good number or not, can you tell us, of people in the Chesapeake who end up serving alongside or with the British Army. So can you first explain what exactly we're talking about here when we talk about Loyalist soldiers?
Yeah.
And what that picture looks like. Again, probably just, you could stick to Maryland and Virginia. We had some questions about some broader regions, but I think today we're gonna have to keep our focus relatively tight.
I mean, I giving exact numbers is very difficult. I mean, broadly speaking, across all 13 colonies, the estimate is about 40,000 or so Americans are actually going to take up arms, and that's both white and black loyalists. Now, there's kind of a hierarchy to how this all works. In some cases, these individuals are actually joining the British Army, redcoats, they're joining the British Navy. But then there is a whole hierarchy of loyalist or provincial establishments that happen. In some cases, this is going to take the form of militias. In places where British have political control, places like New York City, places like down in the Carolinas, they're going to establish loyalist militias. Very little has been written or explored about them because the records just really are very scant. We have temporary kind of volunteer corps that are created, like the Ethiopian Regiment that we mentioned earlier. At the same time that is created, Lord Dunmore creates a white volunteer corps, the Queen's own Loyal Virginia Regiment, which was kind of the white counterpart. It's volunteers created on the governor's authority. There's a number of these volunteer organizations that are created. But really the core of the Loyalist military experience is going to be amongst what are known as the provincial regiments. These are regiments that are raised on the authority of the commander-in-chief in America. They are going to be volunteer, all volunteers, and they are going to be paid, equipped, fed, trained exactly as British troops are going to be. And one of the reasons, not only is this constitute a large number of military loyalists, but it's also a great kind of chunk to study because the money to pay for these guys comes out of the Treasury office. It's kind of considered, extra funding above and beyond normal military expenditures, which means that the Treasury office records over in Britain contain an absolute wealth of information on, who these guys are, where they're being raised, how they're being armed, how they're operating in a military capacity. So for the majority of military loyalists, they're going to see service within one of these provincial regiments. And then actually 5 of the provincial regiments, kind of the 5 best regiments, the ones with the best military records, are actually going to be taken onto what's known as the American establishment during the war, which means that they've kind of transcended this provincial designation and they become essentially part of the British Army. They are going to they kind of still draw the same pay and everything, but their officers get some extra perks and bonuses, which is really a testament to the these are the regiments of men who really carry the burden as far as loyalist regiments go. Some of the most well-known units of the war, the Queen's Rangers, part of the British Legion, the Royal New York Regiment. So these guys are also going to form kind of the spearhead after the war of the men who will settle in Upper Canada and in New Brunswick. The idea being we are going to resettle border of America with the most hardcore, militaristic, avid loyalists we can. And many of them will go on to play a role throughout the early 19th century, you know, up until the War of 1812. So it's a pretty remarkable story there. But if there are any questions about like the specifics of the military service that these guys see.
Well, so I mean, I guess what you're saying though is they're not at all stigmatized, or are they?
Within the British establishment or within the American establishment?
Within the British
Patriots?
establishment. Yeah, within the British establishment.
It's going to vary drastically in terms of what type of unit we're talking about and where and when. There is, and I think this kind of transcends the revolution to any kind of civil war or insurgency. There is some distrust on the part of some British officers. You know, they don't necessarily know if these guys are trustworthy. They don't necessarily know if these guys are going to fight. There's a lot of controversy in the establishment of some of these provincial regiments where, you know, essentially if you're putting one of these regiments together, your commission is based on how many men you bring in. So a lot of these guys are just, you know, the Queen's Rangers is a great example. It's formed in 1776 by Robert Rogers of French and Indian War fame. All of the officers he names are like just toadies and flunkies of his that really have no experience and aren't, you know, the kind of disciplinarians you need to form a military regiment. They start bringing in, basically sweeping the gutters for anyone they can to fill this regiment. And so in 1777, they actually they get rid of most of the officers that Rogers has named. They dismiss a bunch of men from the ranks because they're just not fit. So I think that's kind of the worst fear of the British, is that, you know, these guys are not going to meet the criteria that they want in fighting men. Now, what happens with the Queen's Rangers is, you know, a series of British officers are appointed. They pick kind of the cream of the crop of Americans, particularly actually a lot of Virginians become officers in the Rangers over the course of the war. And, you know, it really turns around for them by the Philadelphia campaign. You know, after the Battle of Brandywine, they're lauded as, you know, one of the hardest fighting units in the Army. And John Simcoe, the commander of the Rangers at that, you know, from 1777 on, writes with great appreciation of the Americans, both in the ranks and the officers. You know, he's constantly complimenting their courage, their bravery, you know, their kind of loyalty to the cause. You know, these people are committed to the fight. And you'll see that with a number of these loyalist provincial regiments. You know, as the war goes on, the British really seem to appreciate the fighting abilities of these guys. Now, you look at like some of these militias or groups, refugees and associators that are kind of like hangers on. Some of these guys are no better than like cattle rustlers and robbers. So there's not much love on either side for those organizations, but within the provincial corps, you know, I think those 5 regiments that get taken onto the American establishment, that's an incredible honor for those units and the men who served in them, and showed just how much the British respected their fighting ability.
So I think we're probably heading towards our time here, but Pete did have one last question, so I'll give him last say here. And I think maybe you've hinted at this already. On the one hand, you did say that these are deeply committed soldiers who show their resolve on the battlefield. But I guess Pete wonders, signing that we've sort of been circling around all night, you know, is there a certain pragmatism? So maybe in under a minute, Travis, or anyone for that matter, is this pragmatism that's driving these men forward, financial reasons, again, localized grudges rather than ideological? Or again, is it such a complex?
There is a lot of that.
Okay.
Yeah, there absolutely is. One thing in a lot of the provincial regiments you see is large numbers of American deserters from the Continental Army, who are just for one reason or another dissatisfied with the lack of pay, lack of food, whatever. But particularly when we look at areas like New Jersey, we look at areas like the New York and Pennsylvania frontier, the Carolinas, you tend, and this is a generalization, you tend to see kind of less of that pure ideology or pure ideological motivations, and more, you know, when authority breaks down, you see a lot of personal grudges play out, particularly in the backcountry areas. You know, we talked about Western loyalism. you're going to see people who are less motivated by ideology and more motivated by settling personal grudges, by settling, a good example, in the Carolinas in the early 1770s, we have this, the Regulators, this movement of backcountry settlers against colonial authority. During the Revolution, a lot of those Regulators who had rebelled against the authority of the governor end up being loyalists because their grudge is not with the king, their grudge is not with Parliament or any of that, taxation. Their grudge is with the planter elite that dominates the colonial government. Well, those are the Patriots in 1776. So you see a lot of ethnic groups play into this as well. Highlanders in the Carolinas tend to favor the Loyalist side. There's a whole clan structure that goes into Highland culture down there that plays into who do you give your loyalty to personally. So it's such a, I wish I had an easy answer. I'm sorry.
No.
Yeah, every loyalist had their own motivation, basically.
As Pete himself knows, after writing an entire book on the war for the common soldier during the Civil War, there's a lot of complexity. And then he, of course, gives a shout out to Rachel Klein's very good book on the South Carolina Regular Movement. The North Carolina Regular Movement was
the
different.
the Regulators that mattered.
Wow.
Can I just say something quickly?
A lot of people, refugees turned out from their homes, and military service in a lot of cases is the only way for these men to really continue.
Can I say something about so we've looked at the views of armed loyalists within the context of the British military officers who are employing them within the campaigns, but something to remember about overarching British strategy, I think, is the role played by loyalist refugees in London in influencing that strategy, and how the kind of the myth of armed loyalism actually contributed to British strategy. So in London, I mean, you have influential loyalists like the last governor of Massachusetts, Thomas Hutchinson, who has the ear of many British politicians, who is convinced that there's a sizable portion, if not a majority portion, of the colonial population are loyalists, and that this is just the whole rebellion is just a bunch of bad apples. And he perpetually pushes this idea throughout the war, and this manifests specifically within the context of the Southern campaign. The idea is that the Southerners are more loyal. We can get down there, we'll be able to reestablish ourselves, have some breathing space to fight the French, and then divert our attention further north once we've pacified the Southern colonies. So the history of loyalism, I think, is very important to understanding the way in which the war was waged, right? And that, so I think that's very important to understand here. And equally, when it comes to understanding the post-war period, one of the major clauses within the 1783 peace treaty had to deal with loyalist property. And the American state governments were, to varying degrees, hesitant to live up to the treaty obligations to provide for loyalist refugees. This in itself led to further animosity with Great Britain, and wasn't really dealt with until the mid 1790s with the various treaties that emerge between Great Britain and the United States. So again, to understand the diplomatic history of the early nation, I think loyalism plays a very important role there. Obviously, when it comes to establishing, understanding the rise of Upper Canada, as we said earlier, I mean, we need to remember the loyalists, as it were. So that's, I guess, I just kind of wanted to end by saying, why should we care? Why do we care about the loyalists? And I think as we approach the 250th anniversary of the signing of the Declaration of Independence, we need to appreciate the more nuanced view of the American Revolution provided by a loyalist perspective.
I mean, we're talking about one of the largest diasporas of that era. I mean, 80,000 odd people left, and many times more than that stayed. So their contributions. And Maya Jansenov's book Liberty's Exile, I think, does an excellent job of showing the contribution of these people who were displaced and how they went on to really shape the future of the Atlantic world.
Absolutely, and you mentioned Lord Simcoe. When he gets to Canada on appointment after the war, he's greeted by these loyalist declarations of communities in Upper Canada who welcome him, but also say, "Look, this is what we expect of you. It's contractual. We have proven our loyalty, so we don't want. This is what we want from the government of Upper Canada." So these people, in a way, replicate what they wanted for their home colonies before the Revolution, and they're able to extract concessions from the British Empire when creating new societies in Canada.
Yeah, that's a fantastic point. I mean, before the war kicks off, it's not like some of these loyalists were part of the pre-revolutionary resistance. You've got people like Daniel Delaney who's writing against the Stamp Act, but then when not every loyalist was perfectly happy with the system. I think a lot of folks just weren't ready to commit to violence or to commit to warfare to get what they wanted. And so I think that's a wonderful point you make about the government of Canada after the war, is that they see a way to remake the institutions they want there, the institutions that they were denied in America.
Absolutely.
So I think we're heading towards that time. I know I have children that need to go to bed. So again, Claire and Michael, for you all out there, we're very proud of our undergraduate students at Shepherd, both of them did phenomenal capstone presentations. Claire presented for us last summer in a program that Ben and Travis were part of. And they're really grappling with some difficult source materials and doing some really serious research. And so we deeply appreciate their contributions. Ben's been very good about augmenting the digital humanities presence at Shepherd and making really meaningful connections with other institutions throughout the country. And so we're profoundly proud of what Ben does and the recognition. He just received a major teaching award. So we're very proud of Ben. And so I just want to say that I appreciate everything you do. Ben's been my best friend and colleague here at Shepherd. Travis Shaw, as always, wonderful insights and perspectives. We have Travis around us with great frequency. We'll have you around more, Travis. We haven't even gone into material culture, and so I promise we'll go there another night. With that, thank you to the audience. I deeply appreciate you all tuning in. Again, I hope everyone is healthy and safe. We deeply value your time, and we'll try to address some of the questions in the comment section that we didn't get to over the course of the program. Maybe Ben or Travis or Claire and Michael can chime in if you want us on Facebook. But with that, I think we're going to close it out. Historians on Tap is this Thursday, I guess.
Yes, we're doing a Historians on Tap on Thursday. And the topic is seances and spiritualism, so it should be a fun time.
Okay, yeah. And for those of you interested in programming that we're doing for the Civil War Center here at Shepherd, just tune into our Facebook page. We have a lot coming up for the next about month and a half. And so with that, I think we'll say good evening, okay? So thank you all so much for tuning in.
Thank you.
And I'm going to go ahead and close this out. So everyone have a good night and stay safe and be well. Thank you so much.